I often wonder why we're bombarded by stories of a case and then poof, as suddenly as it came into our lives, it disappears. And yes, we might go looking for a resolution, but usually we're only as capable of finding answers as the media lets us be. Today's story is one such case that never got that closure, and you've probably never heard of it unless you're from Ireland. It is gaining a little bit more media attention right now as victims begin to seek justice and answers. It's the story of a sudden fire in a nightclub on Valentine's Day in which the victims were unable to escape. So, here we go. Throughout history, Ireland has had its fair share of true horror stories, but one which has always particularly haunted me is the Stardust Fire in the city of Dublin on Valentine's Night in 1981. This one hits hard in large part because of the young age of many of the victims. Of the 841 in attendance on the night, 274 of them were under the age of 18. It's easy to relate the intentions of fun and innocent mischief they must have had leaving their homes that night versus how diametrically opposed things turned out. The Stardust Fire was a freak accident. Yes, I used those bunny ears with great intention here. It occurred at a Dublin disco venue in Artane, North Dublin, in 1981. The patrons of the Stardust nightclub were having a great time just as they would any other night they attended, what for many of them was their favourite nightclub. A familiar place full of familiar faces. The iconic tunes of the early 80s were pumping at full volume. The drinks were flowing as they normally were, plus love was in the air as the night of the incident just so happened to be Valentine's Day. However, unbeknownst to the clientele of the Stardust nightclub, many would fail to find love that night and instead met a disgusting, preventable end. As the party continued into the early hours of the morning, what is purported to have been an electrical fault on the first floor would lead to the building being set ablaze. It just so happened that the room with the electrical fault was filled with 45-gallon drums of cooking oil, a recipe for disaster. The fire would silently take control of the upper floors of the building while partygoers below continued dancing and drinking and having the crack. Some people on the lower floors reportedly noticed a spike in temperature, but there was no smoke or embers to alert them as to what was yet to come. The fire would eventually spill out onto the edges of the dance floor, lighting curtains, tables and chairs on fire. This would prompt the DJ to alert the dance floor that there was a small fire, which progressively built to a frenzy of dancers vying for an escape route as they realised how not small it actually was. By this point, the fire on the top floors of the building could be seen by residents over 200 metres away from the nightclub, showcasing to those outside just how much peril the clubbers were in. The young adults made their way to the emergency fire exits, and this is the bit that really churns my stomach, only to find them padlocked. When management had on a previous occasion found young people had been passing alcohol through the toilet windows, they had them sealed shut with steel sheets, making it impossible for people to escape from them when the fire edged closer. Not to mention the lighting in the club was non-existent, meaning the crowds of people were feeling around in the dark for any path to freedom. Many were injured in the human stampede where in darkness some had tripped and fallen. Others reaching down for dropped objects never came back up and instead were trampled upon by their unwitting friends who clambered over their bodies and faces for a way out. Others were injured by unpredictable falling objects and materials from the roof of the club. Out of the 800 attendees to Stardust nightclub that night, many did find their way out, but 48 clubbers would not make it home, a fact that Irish folk singer Christy Moore would be held for contempt for in court after releasing the song. They never came home, highlighting the events of that night and holding the owners of the club accountable. 214 other attendees would have injuries, some minor, some life-altering. However, all those in attendance that night, and indeed the whole country, would be scarred by the events. The club would never open again, opting to close its doors for good after the horrors of that night. In fact, if you visit the location where all this happened today, you'll find Butterley Business Park. However, the entire front facade of the building remains intact, serving as a reminder of the terrible events of that fateful night. What has compounded to the tragedy of this whole ordeal is the lack of justice that has been dealt in the aftermath of this fire. Sadly, for the families of those who lost their lives, there would be no convictions and no solid answers as to why they lost their loved ones. This one was chalked up as a freak accident resulting from probable arson by someone in attendance. It's worth noting that there is a grand total of 0 evidence for that last part, but the owners were legally exonerated from responsibility. In fact, they sued Dublin Corporation and were compensated with £580,000, while in contrast, Christine Keegan, who lost her 2 daughters, Mary and Martina, in the fire, received £7,500 for each young woman. Many people have always believed that this fire was an intentional one. We can only speculate who would do such a thing. In 2020, the Stardust inquest was reopened, and the surviving victims and loved ones of those who perished are still hoping for answers. A state-sponsored cover-up has even been brought into question. So, what do you think actually happened that night? If you are anything like me, you'll want to deep dive this, and as of right now, there is a feature film based on the event up on YouTube, as well as lots of other information and documentaries. Until we speak again, sending you good vibes. Stay safe out there.